I still remember the exact shade of Richard Montgomery's face when he slammed his fist on the polished mahogany table, sending wine glasses trembling across the surface. What do you know about real investing, Elena? Your little ethical portfolio idea is nothing but a charity project. The table erupted in laughter, his golden children, Jessica and Andrew, leading the chorus. My husband, Kevin, stared at his plate, silent as always when his family turned on me. No one noticed the small smile I couldn't quite hide. Just that morning, I'd received confirmation that Greenlight Capital wanted to back my sustainable investment methodology with $10 million in seed funding. The very approach my father-in-law had just torn to shreds in front of everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Wright, formerly Elena Montgomery Wright when I was still playing the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law at Montgomery Financial Group. At 34, I was supposed to be grateful for my position as their diversity hire in client relations. At least that's how Jessica always introduced me at company functions. The reality was that I had an MBA from Wharton and had developed an algorithm for identifying untapped growth potential in sustainable energy markets that the traditional Montgomery approach couldn't begin to comprehend. Lakefield, Connecticut, is precisely as pretentious as it sounds. A haven for old money financial firms where 3 generations of Montgomery men had built their empire managing the wealth of people exactly like themselves. The glass tower of Montgomery Financial stood like a monument to conventional thinking in the center of the business district. Its logo, a stylized M meant to evoke stability and tradition, visible for blocks in every direction. I joined the firm 5 years ago, shortly after marrying Kevin. He wasn't like the rest of his family, or so I thought. Quieter, more thoughtful, less obsessed with appearances. When we met at a charity gala in New York, he seemed genuinely interested in my research on market patterns in renewable energy investments. 6 months later, we were married, and I had relocated from my small but promising position at a forward-thinking boutique firm in Manhattan to the gilded cage of Montgomery Financial in Lakefield. You'll have resources there you can't imagine, Kevin had promised, his blue eyes earnest. Dad is old school, but once he sees your work, he'll understand its potential. 5 years later, I was still waiting for that moment of understanding. Instead, I'd been relegated to client relations, essentially entertaining the wives of wealthy clients, while the men discussed their real business with Richard, Jessica, and Andrew. My investment models and market analyses were repeatedly shelved in favor of the same conservative strategies the firm had been using since the Reagan administration. Our home in Lakefield Heights was modest by Montgomery standards, a mere 5 bedrooms instead of the 12 at the family estate. Still, it was in the right neighborhood, with the right address to maintain Kevin's standing in the family hierarchy. Each morning as I dressed for work, selecting one of the appropriately conservative outfits that Jessica had once helpfully suggested would help me fit in better, I felt like I was putting on a costume for a role I was increasingly unsuited to play. The dinner parties were the worst. Monthly gatherings where the Montgomery clan and their inner circle of financial elite would congregate to congratulate themselves on their market insights and reinforce their collective worldview. The women discussed charity galas and private school applications, while the men smoked cigars and discussed serious matters on the terrace. I existed in an uncomfortable middle ground, too educated to fit in with the wives, but unwelcome in the business conversations despite my qualifications. So, Elena, any exciting developments in your, what do you call it again, ethical investing? Patricia Reynolds would ask, wife of Victor Reynolds, head of Montgomery Financial's biggest competitor. Her voice would be sweet, but her eyes calculating. Sustainable market analysis, I would correct, maintaining my composure. And yes, I've been tracking some interesting patterns in renewable energy startups with strong growth potential. That's nice, she'd reply, exchanging glances with Jessica's husband, William. So sustainable. The men were less subtle. Andrew, with his Harvard MBA and family-bestowed title of Chief Financial Officer, took particular pleasure in dismantling my ideas over brandy. The problem, Elena, is that you're looking at investing through a naive lens, he'd explain loudly, as if speaking to a child. Feel-good environmental plays are fine for celebrities trying to improve their image, but serious investors need serious returns. It's admirable, really, your idealism, but it's not a business model. William, Jessica's husband and the firm's head of client acquisition, would inevitably chime in with his assessment. Let's run the numbers, shall we? Even with generous projections, the sectors you're targeting underperform traditional energy by what? 3-4 percentage points. No client with serious capital would accept that trade-off for a warm, fuzzy feeling. I would sit there, smiling, tightly as they dissected my life's work as if it were a misguided hobby. Kevin would sometimes glance at me apologetically but never intervene. Later, he'd tell me, "They're just trying to help you understand the business. They've been doing this for generations, Elena. Generations of the same thinking, the same assumptions, the same dismissal of anything that challenged their worldview." What none of them knew, what I hadn't even told Kevin yet, was that my naive approach had caught the attention of Naomi Chen, founder of Greenlight Capital and legendary for her ability to spot market trends before they emerged. She had reviewed my models, tested my algorithms against historical data, and recognized what the Montgomerys couldn't: that sustainable investments weren't just ethically superior, but positioned for explosive growth as regulatory landscapes evolved. The contract sitting in my personal email would provide $10 million to launch Right Capital, my own investment firm focused exclusively on my sustainable growth model. Greenlight would have a 30% stake, but I would maintain controlling interest and full operational authority. I had been waiting for the final signatures before making any announcements. Waiting, perhaps, for the right moment to reveal that the hobby they all dismissed with such confidence might soon be competing for their clients. The night everything changed was supposed to be a celebration of Montgomery Financial securing the Turner account, a $500 million portfolio that had been with Reynolds Capital for 3 generations. Kevin had been instrumental in the acquisition, and Richard had arranged a special dinner at the estate to recognize his contribution. I spent the day preparing mentally, selecting a dress that walked the line between professional and appropriate for a family celebration, rehearsing diplomatic responses to the inevitable condescension. By 7 p.m., the Montgomery estate was filled with the usual suspects: the men in bespoke suits that advertised their success without saying a word, the women in designer dresses chosen to complement but never overshadow their husbands. The air was thick with expensive cologne and the distinct scent of entitlement. I was returning from checking my makeup in the powder room when I overheard Andrew and William in Richard's study. "Kevin's finally proving himself, but I worry about Elena holding him back." Andrew's voice had that particular tone people use when they're enjoying the concern they're expressing. "How long is Richard going to let her play investment advisor before he realizes she needs to either fall in line or move on?" "I know," William replied. "Kevin mentioned they're dipping into their principal to fund some research for her sustainable investing project. Can you imagine? Using capital that could be appreciating in a proper portfolio to chase environmental unicorns. The problem with women like Elena," Andrew added, lowering his voice but not enough, "is they don't understand that this business isn't about feeling good about your investments. It's about performance. Period. She's not built for this world." I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand gripping my clutch so tightly my knuckles turned white. I'd suspected these conversations happened behind my back, but hearing them stated so plainly, so dismissively discuss my life's work, made my chest constrict. Then came the worst part. Kevin's voice, slightly hesitant but clearly audible. "Yeah, I've been trying to be supportive, but you guys are right. It's been 5 years, and she's still pushing the same boulder uphill. I don't know how much longer I can keep defending her ideas to my father." The betrayal struck like a physical blow. I nearly turned and left the house immediately, but instead took a deep breath and composed my expression into the pleasant mask I'd perfected over 5 years of Montgomery dinners. I walked into the dining room just as Margaret, Richard's housekeeper for 20 years, announced that dinner was served. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The meal progressed with the usual rhythms. Talk of market performance, the brilliance of Kevin's approach to the Turner acquisition, Andrew's insights into emerging tax advantages for certain investment structures. I served the appropriate responses when addressed directly, participated when necessary, but inside I was rebuilding myself, brick by brick. It was during dessert, Margaret's famous crème brûlée, that Richard turned his attention to me. "So, Elena," he said, breaking the caramelized surface with his spoon. "Any exciting developments in your pet project? Still trying to save the world one solar panel at a time?" The table went quiet, anticipating the usual dynamic where I would offer some modest update, and they would nod patronizingly before returning to their important conversations. But not tonight. "Actually," I said, setting down my spoon with a deliberate motion, "I received some interesting news this morning." Something in my tone made Kevin look up sharply. "Naomi Chen from Greenlight Capital has offered to back my sustainable investment methodology with seed funding." The silence that followed was absolute. Andrew's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "Naomi Chen? From Greenlight?" Richard asked, his voice unnaturally tight. I nodded, taking a slow sip of my dessert wine. "Apparently, she's been following my research for some time. She believes my algorithms for identifying growth. Potential in sustainable markets are, what did she call it? The most innovative approach to emerging market dynamics she's seen in a decade." That's wonderful," Kevin stammered, looking genuinely shocked. Richard's complexion had taken on an interesting shade I could only describe as fiscal, emergency red. William, ever the numbers man, couldn't help himself. "What kind of backing are we talking about?" His tone suggested he expected the answer to be underwhelming. I met his gaze directly. "Initial seed funding of $10 million for 30% equity, with potential for an additional $15 million in Series A once certain benchmarks are met." I paused, letting the implications sink in. "I'll maintain controlling interest and operational authority for Right Capital, which will focus exclusively on sustainable growth portfolios using my proprietary methodology." Jessica nearly choked on her wine. William suddenly became very interested in the pattern on his dessert plate. But Richard's reaction was the one I'd waited 5 years to see. His face cycled through disbelief, calculation, and finally, a grudging reassessment. "10 million?" he repeated. "For an unproven model?" "Oh, it's not unproven," I replied calmly. Naomi's team back-tested it against market data for the past decade. In 8 of 10 years, it outperformed traditional models by an average of 4. 3 percentage points, with significantly reduced volatility during market downturns. "Why didn't you bring this to Montgomery Financial?" Andrew demanded, his voice tight with what might have been anger or envy. "This is a family business, Elena." I met his eyes steadily. "I did. 3 times in 5 years. My reports are still sitting in your father's consideration file. I didn't add what we all knew, that the file was Richard's euphemism for ideas he had no intention of exploring." Kevin was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" His voice held an accusation. That made something harden inside me. "I wanted to wait until it was official," I said simply. I didn't add, and I wanted to see if you would defend me to your family before I shared my success. The words hung unspoken between us. The conversation shifted dramatically after that. Suddenly, everyone wanted details about my methodology, my growth projections, my client acquisition strategy. The very ideas they'd dismissed as irrelevant for years were now fascinating, even impressive. As I described my plans for Greenlight Capital, I noticed a subtle tension among the Montgomery men. They exchanged glances I couldn't quite interpret. Later, I would understand what those looks meant. Later, I would learn that while I'd been developing my idealistic investment approach, Montgomery Financial had been making increasingly risky bets on traditional sectors that were showing early warning signs of instability. But that night, I simply enjoyed the sweet taste of vindication as Richard, with visible effort, raised his glass in a toast to my success. Only I noticed that Kevin's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his glass, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Something had shifted that night. In my career, in my marriage, in the delicate power balance the Montgomerys had maintained for generations. A rebalancing had begun, and none of us understood yet how completely our worlds would change in the months to come. The weeks following that dinner party were a whirlwind of activity. I finalized the agreement with Greenlight Capital, secured a small office space in a renovated industrial building on the other side of Lakefield, as far from Montgomery Financial's tower as I could reasonably get, and began the process of building Greenlight Capital from the ground up. My first hire was Zoe Chen, a brilliant data analyst I'd met at a sustainable investment conference 2 years earlier. She had been working at a large firm in Boston where her talents were underutilized and her innovative approaches frequently sidelined, a story that sounded all too familiar. "I can't believe you're actually doing this," she said during our first meeting in the empty office space, her voice filled with admiration as she reviewed my business plan. "Most people talk about breaking away and building something different, but they never take the leap." I had a little push, I admitted, thinking of that overheard conversation in Richard's study. Sometimes your enemies do you the greatest favor by showing you exactly who they are. Home had become a complicated space. Kevin oscillated between excitement about my venture and anxiety about how it would affect his position at Montgomery Financial. Some evenings he would pore over my projections with genuine interest, offering insights from his experience with high-net-worth clients. Other nights he would return late, tense and withdrawn, after private meetings with his father and siblings. "You know, this creates a delicate situation for me," he said one night as we sat on opposite ends of our living room sofa, the distance between us physical and emotional. "Dad is concerned about potential conflicts of interest with you competing for the same client base." "I'm targeting a completely different segment," I pointed out. "Emerging wealth, tech entrepreneurs, next-generation heirs who want their portfolios aligned with their values. Montgomery Financial has never shown interest in those clients." "It's still finance in Lakefield," he countered, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd heard too often from his family. "There will be overlap, perceptions to manage. Dad suggests it might be cleaner if you focused on a different market entirely. Maybe New York or Boston." I studied him carefully, seeing for the first time how deeply the Montgomery worldview was embedded in him, despite his occasional rebellions. "I'm not relocating my business to make your father more comfortable, Kevin. Greenlight Capital is launching in Lakefield." Something shifted in his expression, a hardening I recognized from Richard's face when he encountered opposition. "Then we may need to discuss our arrangement." "Our arrangement?" I repeated, the words landing like ice in my stomach. "You mean our marriage?" He didn't answer directly. "Family is everything in this business, Elena. The Montgomery name opens doors that would remain closed otherwise." "And what has your family name done for me except ensure I was never taken seriously?" The question hung between us, unanswered as he retreated to the guest bedroom for the night. While my marriage showed increasing fracture lines, Right Capital was taking shape with remarkable speed. The office transformation was nearly complete, open concept with sustainability at its core. Reclaimed wood desks, energy-efficient systems, living plant walls that improved air quality while making a statement about our values. In addition to Zoe, I'd hired Marcus Diaz, a market analyst with specialized knowledge of renewable energy sectors, and Taylor Washington, a client relations expert who had grown disillusioned with the outdated approach at one of Lakefield's other traditional firms. Our small team worked with the passionate intensity that comes from building something you genuinely believe in. What I didn't know was that Montgomery Financial was facing serious challenges. The first hint came from an unexpected source, Camilla Torres, a financial reporter for the Lakefield Business Journal, who had reached out to profile Right Capital as a new entrant in the local financial scene. "Interesting timing for your launch," she remarked as we sat in my newly furnished office, the afternoon sun streaming through energy-efficient windows. Especially with the whispers about Montgomery Financial's exposure to the bellwether situation. I kept my expression neutral despite the surge of interest her comment triggered. "I'm not familiar with any particular situation," I said carefully. "My launch timing is related to securing the right backing and completing my methodology testing." Camilla's smile was knowing. "Of course. But given your family connections, I thought you might have insights into how the Montgomerys are handling the fallout from Bellwether Energy's regulatory issues. Those fossil fuel holdings represent a significant portion of their managed assets, from what my sources indicate." This was news to me, significant news that Kevin had never mentioned despite our frequent discussions about the industry. Bellwether Energy was a traditional energy conglomerate that had been facing increasing scrutiny for environmental violations and questionable accounting practices. If Montgomery Financial was heavily invested there, it could mean serious trouble depending on the outcome of the investigations. Right Capital's focus is forward-looking, I replied diplomatically. We're concerned with where markets are heading, not where they've been. After Camilla left, I immediately began researching Bellwether Energy's situation. What I found was disturbing. Mounting evidence of systematic regulatory violations, class action lawsuits from affected communities, and increasing calls for financial penalties that could devastate their stock value. If Montgomery Financial had significant client funds invested there based on Richard's unwavering faith in traditional energy, they could be facing a crisis. I considered calling Kevin to discuss this, but remembered his recent coldness, his retreat into Montgomery family ranks. Instead, I focused on finalizing preparations for Right Capital's official launch, now just 2 weeks away. The morning of our launch event, I arrived at the office early to find Zoe already there, putting final touches on our presentation materials. "The RSVP list is impressive," she said, handing me a coffee. 3 tech founders from the innovation corridor, representatives from 2 university endowments, and that sustainability-focused family office from Hartford. "Any word from the Lakefield financial community?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Radio silence from the old guard," she confirmed, though Camilla Torres will be covering it for the Business Journal, and she carries weight. I nodded, unsurprised by the establishment's cold shoulder. "We don't need their approval, just their clients." The launch event exceeded our expectations. Our modern, sustainable office space was filled with exactly the kind of forward-thinking investors we hope to attract. My presentation on sustainable growth strategies, complete with compelling data on both financial returns and positive impact metrics, generated exactly the engaged response we'd hoped for. I was speaking with the representative from Dartmouth's endowment when a commotion at the entrance caught my attention. Kevin stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his eyes scanning the room until they locked on mine. The expression on his face sent a chill through me, a mixture of anger, fear, and something that looked surprisingly like respect. "We need to talk," he said when he reached me, his voice low and urgent. "Privately." I excused myself and led. Him to my office, closing the door on the successful event unfolding beyond. "This is a surprise," I said, maintaining my composure despite the tension radiating from him. "I didn't expect any Montgomery representation today." "Have you seen the news?" he demanded, pulling out his phone and thrusting it toward me. The headline from the Financial Times was stark. "Bellwether Energy faces criminal charges. Stock plummets 60%. The subheading was even more devastating. "Major institutional investors facing significant exposure. Montgomery Financial reportedly among hardest hit." "How bad is it?" I asked, meeting his eyes directly. He ran a hand through his usually immaculate hair. "Bad. Really bad. Dad put nearly 40% of our managed assets into Bellwether and related holdings over the past 3 years. He was convinced the political winds would shift back in their favor." His laugh was hollow. He kept saying your sustainable energy picks were too risky while he was doubling down on a company under federal investigation. The irony was almost too perfect. What happens now? Emergency meetings all day, client calls pouring in. The Turner account is already threatening to pull out. He hesitated, then added, "Dad wants to talk to you." "To me?" This was unexpected. "About what?" Kevin's expression was complicated, part embarrassment, part desperate hope. "Your models predicted this, didn't they? The shift away from companies with poor environmental practices, the vulnerability of firms like Bellwether to regulatory action." I nodded slowly. "That's been central to my thesis for 5 years. Unsustainable business practices eventually create unsustainable financial outcomes. Dad he needs your insight on how to reposition, immediately." Kevin couldn't quite meet my eyes as he delivered Richard's request, or more likely, his demand. "He's offering you a position as Director of Strategic Investments." I stared at him, momentarily speechless at the audacity. After years of dismissal and derision, Richard Montgomery thought he could snap his fingers and have me rush to save the firm that had systematically undermined me at every turn. "I have my own firm now," I said quietly, gesturing to the space around us, to the successful launch event continuing without me. "With clients who actually respect my approach and my expertise. Elena, this is the Montgomery family legacy at stake," Kevin said, his voice taking on the entitled tone I'd heard too often from his father. 3 generations of financial leadership in this community. 3 generations of the same thinking, the same blind spots, the same dismissal of anything that challenged the status quo, I countered. "And now that approach has put your clients' assets at serious risk. So you won't help?" His expression hardened. "Even knowing what this means for me? For us?" I considered my response carefully. "I'll meet with Richard, as a professional courtesy. But I won't abandon Right Capital or what we're building here." Kevin's relief was visible, but tempered with lingering resentment. "He'll be expecting you at the office by 4 p.m. After he left, I returned to our launch event with renewed confidence. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. A room full of engaged, forward-thinking investors excited about our approach, versus a panicking traditional firm facing the consequences of its rigid thinking. Whatever Richard wanted to discuss, I would be entering the conversation from a position of strength I had earned entirely on my own. At precisely 3:55 p.m., I walked into the marble lobby of Montgomery Financial Group for the first time as a competitor rather than an employee. The receptionist, who had ignored my ideas for years, snapped to attention and immediately ushered me toward Richard's corner office without the usual waiting period. The shift in treatment was as satisfying as it was transparent. Richard's office occupied the building's prime corner, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lakefield's business district. He stood as I entered, his usual commanding presence diminished by the strain evident in his expression. Andrew and Jessica were already seated at the conference table, both looking like they'd aged years in a single day. "Elena," Richard said, making a visible effort to sound gracious. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." I took a seat across from them, noting the Montgomery family closing ranks in crisis. "Kevin mentioned there's a situation with Bellwether Energy that you wanted to discuss." Richard nodded grimly. "I'll be direct. Montgomery Financial is facing a significant challenge due to our position in several traditional energy holdings that have encountered regulatory complications. Criminal charges," I corrected calmly, "and a 60% stock devaluation in a single day." Andrew's jaw tightened, but Richard nodded. "Yes, the situation is serious. We're looking at potential client withdrawals of up to $2 billion if we don't demonstrate a convincing strategy for recovery and repositioning." "And what does this have to do with me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Your research on sustainable market transitions has proven prescient," Richard admitted, clearly struggling with the acknowledgement. "Your models anticipated regulatory risks that our traditional analysis overlooked." Jessica leaned forward. "We need your expertise, Elena, immediately. Dad is prepared to offer you the position of Director of Strategic Investments with complete authority to implement your methodology across our portfolio. With appropriate supervision, of course," Andrew added quickly. I allowed myself a small smile. "By appropriate supervision, you mean the same people who dismissed my approach as naive and unrealistic for 5 years?" Richard cleared his throat. "The offer includes a seat on the executive committee, full voting rights, and," he added with visible effort, "public acknowledgement of your contribution to the firm's new direction." 3 weeks ago, this offer would have been everything I'd fought for: recognition, authority, vindication. Now, looking at the 3 Montgomerys watching me with barely disguised desperation, it felt like too little, too late. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but my commitment is to Wright Capital now. We launched successfully today, with significant interest from exactly the kind of forward-thinking clients we want to attract." "This is about family, Elena," Richard said, his voice hardening. "About legacy, about your responsibilities as a Montgomery." "I'm a Wright," I reminded him. "And I've never been treated as part of the Montgomery legacy except when it was convenient for appearances." "What would it take?" Andrew interjected, his business instinct overriding family pride. "A better title? Higher compensation? Profit? Sharing?" I considered the question seriously. Complete restructuring of the firm's approach, sustainable principles at the core of all investment decisions, not as a side project or marketing gimmick. New blood in senior management, including people from outside the family circle with diverse perspectives. The silence that followed told me everything. They wanted my expertise to save them from the immediate crisis, but they had no intention of fundamentally changing the Montgomery way of doing business. "I didn't think so," I said, rising from my seat. "I'm willing to consult on transitioning your most vulnerable positions on a professional basis. My firm charges $15,000 per hour for specialized consultation. Kevin has my business contact information." As I turned to leave, Richard's voice stopped me. "You know this isn't over, Elena. Lakefield is a small community. The financial world has a long memory." I met his gaze directly. "You're right about one thing, Richard. This isn't over. It's just beginning." Walking away from Montgomery Financial. That afternoon was the most liberated I'd felt in 5 years. The marble lobby, once intimidating, now seemed like a mausoleum, a monument to outdated thinking. As the glass doors closed behind me, I took my first deep breath of truly free air and stepped into the bright spring sunshine of Lakefield's financial district. My phone buzzed immediately. Kevin, undoubtedly wanting to know the outcome of my meeting with his father. I silenced it and continued walking, past the rows of traditional financial institutions with their imposing facades and meaningless Latin mottos etched in stone. Wright Capital might be small, but it was alive in a way these dinosaurs couldn't comprehend. By the time I returned to our office, most of our launch guests had departed, but the energy of success lingered. Zoe looked up from her computer, her expression questioning. So, how was the summons to Montgomery Castle? I dropped into the chair across from her desk, kicking off my heels with a sigh of relief. They're panicking. Bellwether Energy is facing criminal charges, and apparently Richard had nearly 40% of their managed assets tied up in related holdings. Zoe whistled low. That's not diversification. That's doubling down on dinosaurs. Exactly what my models predicted 3 years ago, I said, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and concern. Despite everything, people's life savings were at stake. People who had trusted the Montgomery name and reputation. Let me guess, Marcus said, joining us with a tablet displaying Bellwether's catastrophic stock chart. They want you to swoop in and save the day with the same sustainable investment strategy they've been mocking for years. Complete with a fancy title and appropriate supervision, I confirmed. I told them my consulting rate is $15,000 an hour. The three of us laughed, but the reality of what was unfolding sobered us quickly. Montgomery Financial managed over $30 billion in assets. If they faced a crisis of confidence resulting in massive withdrawals, the ripple effects could impact the entire Lakefield financial community, including our fledgling firm. "What's your actual plan?" Taylor asked, perceptive as always. "Beyond enjoying the schadenfreude, I mean." It was a fair question. Despite my lingering resentment, I had to think strategically. We accelerate our growth plan. The Montgomery crisis means there will be clients looking for new homes for their money. We need to be positioned as the forward-thinking alternative. That night, I returned to an empty house. Kevin had left a terse note on the kitchen counter. "Staying at the office. Crisis management team working through the night." No mention of our relationship, of how the power shift was affecting us personally. Just business, as always with the Montgomerys. I poured a glass of wine and settled on our back deck, looking out at the manicured garden that had always felt more like a Montgomery status symbol than a home. My phone rang. Not Kevin, but Dr. Sophia Lynn, my former professor and mentor from business school. "I saw the Bellwether news," she said, without preamble. "And I heard about your launch today. Timing is everything, isn't it?" I smiled at her characteristic directness. Pure coincidence, though my models did flag Bellwether as high risk years ago. "I know they did. I remember reviewing your thesis." Her voice turned serious. "Elena, this situation presents an extraordinary opportunity, but also significant danger. The Montgomerys won't go down without a fight, and they still have powerful connections in Lakefield. I'm aware," I said, thinking of Richard's parting words. "The financial world has a long memory." "What you need is leverage," Sophia continued. "And I may have something that could help. Are you free for lunch tomorrow?" After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, contemplating how quickly life could transform. 6 months ago, I had been the tolerated daughter-in-law, my professional insights dismissed while I was expected to play the supportive wife role. Now I was a competitor, a threat, possibly soon to be an ex-wife if Kevin's recent behavior was any indication. The next morning, my office phone rang before I'd even set down my coffee. The caller ID showed Montgomery Financial reception. "Elena Wright," I answered professionally. "Please hold for Richard Montgomery," the receptionist said, her tone suggesting the call was unusual enough to unsettle her. Richard's voice came through moments later, lacking its usual commanding tone. "Elena, we need to meet again. The situation has evolved overnight." "I provided my consulting rates yesterday," I reminded him. "This isn't about consulting." He paused, and I could almost feel his struggle to maintain composure. "This is about acquisition potential." I nearly dropped my coffee. "Acquisition? Of Wright Capital?" We just launched. The bellwether situation has accelerated certain considerations. Our major shareholders are demanding immediate action to stabilize the firm. Another pause. Your sustainable investment methodology is now seen as strategically necessary. The board is prepared to make a substantial offer to acquire Right Capital and install you as Chief Investment Officer at Montgomery Financial. The irony was almost too perfect. The methodology dismissed as naive idealism yesterday was strategically necessary today. I'm not interested in being acquired, Richard. Right Capital is independent by design. 10 million, he said, flatly. Plus the CIO position with full voting rights on the executive committee and a guaranteed 3-year contract. I thought of the $10 million Greenlight had invested for a 30% stake. Richard was offering the same amount for 100% control, thinking he could simply absorb my vision into the Montgomery machine. Not interested, I said firmly. But I'm available for lunch if you'd like to discuss how Montgomery Financial might partner with Right Capital as separate entities. It was a professional courtesy, nothing more. This isn't a negotiation, Elena, Richard's voice hardened. The Montgomery name still means something in Lakefield. Doors that are open to you now can close very quickly. His threat was as clear as it was desperate. Threatening me isn't a productive negotiation strategy, Richard. I'm having lunch with Sophia Lynn today, but I could meet you at 3. The mention of Sophia, a respected figure in financial circles who had famously taken down several arrogant investment houses during her Wall Street career, gave him pause. Fine. 3 o'clock. The Lakefield Club. The Lakefield Club. Of course, he would choose the bastion of old money where 3 generations of Montgomerys had made deals over brandy and cigars. A place where women had only been admitted as members in the last decade, and reluctantly at that. The Riverside Cafe at 3, I countered. Neutral ground. His silence spoke volumes, but finally he agreed. As I hung up, Zoe looked at me questioningly. Richard Montgomery just offered to buy Right Capital for $10 million, I explained, still processing the conversation. That's insulting, she said after a moment. After what Greenlight invested for a minority stake? He's trying to get your methodology for pennies on the dollar. Exactly. And he threatened to use the Montgomery influence to close doors for us if I don't accept. I shook my head. He still doesn't understand that the world is changing. The Montgomery name won't mean much if they lose the Turner account and others follow. My lunch with Sophia Lynn provided unexpected clarity. We met at her favorite Vietnamese restaurant, far from the financial district where Montgomery eyes and ears might be present. Victor Reynolds called me this morning, she said once we'd ordered. He's watching the Montgomery situation with great interest. Victor Reynolds, head of Reynolds Capital and Montgomery Financial's chief rival, was known for his strategic aggression in acquiring valuable assets. What's his angle? I asked, knowing Sophia wouldn't have mentioned it without purpose. He's been wanting to modernize Reynolds Capital's approach to sustainable investing, but lacks the in-house expertise. She sipped her tea. The bellwether disaster has created a unique window. Reynolds is positioning to acquire firms affected by the Montgomery collapse. I processed this information, seeing the chess moves taking shape. And he wants Right Capital's methodology to differentiate his offering? Sophia smiled enigmatically. Better. He wants Right Capital to help him acquire Montgomery Financial itself. I nearly choked on my tea. That's ambitious. Montgomery Financial is vulnerable in ways it hasn't been for 3 generations. Their major clients are nervous, their stock is sliding, and most importantly, they lack a convincing story about their path forward. She leaned forward. Victor is prepared to make a hostile tender offer for Montgomery Financial within the week. He wants your firm to provide the sustainable investment methodology that would form the cornerstone of the restructured company. My mind raced with implications. If Reynolds acquired Montgomery Financial, the combined entity would be the dominant financial institution in Lakefield. And if Wright Capital's methodology was central to the new direction, it would validate everything I'd been fighting for. "What's the structure he's proposing?" I asked, my business instincts overriding the emotional complexity. Wright Capital remains independent, but enters an exclusive partnership with the new Reynolds Montgomery entity. You get a significant consulting contract, a seat on their board, and most importantly, Reynolds will acquire all Montgomery Financial common stock, including the family's controlling shares. The last part was the key. The Montgomery family would lose control of the firm that had been their identity for generations. Richard, Andrew, Jessica, and yes, Kevin would become employees rather than owners, if they were kept at all. "Victor wants to meet with you today," Sophia added. "After your meeting with Richard." I nodded slowly, my lunch forgotten as the pieces aligned in my mind. "I'll need to review any proposal carefully. Wright Capital's independence is non-negotiable." "Of course," Sophia agreed. "But consider this. Working with Reynolds gives you the leverage to reshape Lakefield's financial landscape according to your vision without surrendering your autonomy." As we parted, she added one final thought. "The Montgomerys have been dictating terms in this town for 3 generations, Elena. Perhaps it's time someone else wrote the rules." The Riverside Cafe was busy with the lunch crowd when I arrived for my meeting with Richard, but the corner table I'd reserved offered sufficient privacy for difficult conversations. He arrived precisely at 3, his tailored suit and commanding presence drawing glances from other patrons. But I noticed what others might miss: the slight dishevelment of his pocket square, the tension around his eyes, the way his normally straight shoulders carried an invisible weight. "Elena," he said, taking the seat across from me. He declined the menu the server offered. "I won't be staying long." "Coffee at least," I insisted, maintaining the pretense of civility. "This conversation deserves basic courtesies." His jaw tightened, but he ordered an espresso. When the server departed, he leaned forward. "I'll cut to the chase. The board has authorized me to increase our offer to $15 million for Wright Capital, plus the CIO position and a 5-year contract, with performance incentives." I sipped my tea calmly. "Richard, I'm not selling Wright Capital. Not for $15 million, not for $50 million. My vision for sustainable investment can't be properly executed within Montgomery Financial's current structure. This is about Kevin, isn't it?" he challenged, his voice low but intense. Some kind of revenge for perceived slights. The suggestion was so divorced from reality that I almost laughed. "This is about business, Richard. The same way it's always been business for you. My methodology works because it exists outside the constraints of traditional thinking, the kind that led Montgomery Financial to put 40% of its managed assets into bellwether energy, despite clear warning signs." His espresso arrived, and he took the momentary interruption to compose himself. "We've received calls from 3 major institutional clients this morning, all expressing concern about their positions. The Turner account is reviewing their options." "I'm genuinely sorry about that," I said, and meant it. "But acquiring Wright Capital isn't the solution. Your clients are questioning the judgment that led to the bellwether exposure in the first place. Bringing in my methodology without addressing the underlying governance issues would be window dressing." "What exactly are you suggesting?" His tone was dangerous now. "A true restructuring. New blood on the executive committee. Not just me, but outside perspectives with diverse viewpoints. A commitment to sustainable principles across all investment decisions. And," I added, knowing this would be the most difficult, "a reconsideration of the family-dominated leadership model." Richard's expression darkened. "You want the Montgomerys to surrender control of our own firm." "I want Montgomery Financial to survive and thrive in a changing financial landscape," I corrected, "which may require evolving beyond a family-dominated approach that led to the current crisis." He set down his espresso cup with deliberate control. "Impossible. The family holds controlling interest, and we've weathered greater challenges than bellwether energy." "Have you?" I asked quietly. "From what I understand, this exposure represents the largest concentration of risk in the firm's history. And it comes at a time when your competitors are actively positioning to take advantage of your vulnerability." Something in my tone made him pause. "What have you heard?" I chose my next words carefully. "Only market rumors, but significant ones." Before he could respond, my phone vibrated with a text. "Sophia, right on cue. Reynolds ready when you are. Signature Club, 4:30. I showed Richard the screen, watching comprehension dawn in his eyes. "You've been talking to Victor Reynolds." "I've been approached by various interested parties," I said neutrally. "As I said, this isn't personal, Richard. It's business." For the first time in our 5-year acquaintance, I saw something approaching. Respect in Richard Montgomery's expression. Also calculation, anger, and concern, but definitely respect. What would a partnership between Montgomery Financial and Greenlight Capital actually look like? He asked. His tone shifted to genuine negotiation, rather than dictation. Hypothetically, I outlined the basic framework. Greenlight Capital remaining independent but providing sustainable investment methodology to Montgomery portfolios through a licensing arrangement. Montgomery implementing governance reforms including outside directors, and a clear succession plan that would evaluate leadership candidates on merit rather than family connection. Richard listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he stood abruptly. "I need to consult with the board and the family." "Of course," I said. "I have another meeting at 4:30, but I'm available after 6. His eyes narrowed at the implied deadline. "The Montgomery name has been synonymous with financial excellence in Lakefield for 70 years, Elena. That legacy won't be dismantled in a day, regardless of temporary setbacks." "The world is changing, Richard," I said simply. "The question is whether Montgomery Financial will change with it, or be changed by it." After he left, I sat for a few moments, processing the shifting dynamics. Richard was a formidable opponent, wounded but still dangerous. And I had yet to speak with Kevin since our confrontation the previous day. The personal and professional were colliding in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. My meeting with Victor Reynolds at the Signature Club, the modern counterpoint to the traditional Lakefield club, further clarified the stakes. Reynolds was everything Richard Montgomery was not: tech-savvy, progressive in his business approach, and completely unsentimental about tradition. Montgomery Financial is a dinosaur, with excellent bones, he explained, his directness refreshing after years of Montgomery obliqueness. Their client relationships are valuable, their market position is strong despite the bellwether debacle, and their operational infrastructure is solid. What they lack is forward-thinking leadership and modern investment strategies. Which you believe Greenlight Capital can provide, I suggested. Your sustainable investment methodology provides the perfect narrative for a Reynolds acquisition, he confirmed. We absorb Montgomery Financial, install your approach as the centerpiece of our reformed investment strategy, and position the combined entity as the future of responsible wealth management. And the Montgomery family? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Victor's smile was sharp. Reduced to minority shareholders at best. Richard might retain a ceremonial role during the transition, but the next generation, particularly Andrew and Jessica, would need to demonstrate value beyond their last name, which frankly seems unlikely based on their track records. And Kevin? I couldn't help asking. Victor's expression turned sympathetic. That's complicated by your personal connection, of course. His role would depend entirely on his willingness to adapt to the new reality. The proposal Reynolds outlined was aggressive but clean. A tender offer for Montgomery Financial shares at a 15% premium over current market value, which had already been depressed by the bellwether news. Greenlight Capital would remain independent, but would license our methodology exclusively to the new Reynolds entity for a substantial annual fee plus performance incentives. I'll need time to consider this, I said when he finished. There are personal complexities involved. Of course, Victor agreed smoothly. But not too much time. The window created by Montgomery's vulnerability won't stay open indefinitely. I left the Signature Club with my mind spinning, walking the 3 blocks to Wright Capital's offices to clear my head. The spring evening was mild, cherry blossoms lining Lakefield's immaculate streets. Couples strolled hand in hand, seemingly oblivious to the financial power struggles unfolding around them. My phone rang. Kevin for the 4th time that day. This time, I answered. "Where are you?" he demanded without preamble. "Dad said you met this afternoon and threatened a Reynolds takeover." "I'm walking back to my office," I said calmly. "And I didn't threaten anything. I simply acknowledged market realities that your father seems determined to ignore." "This is our family legacy, Elena." Kevin's voice cracked with emotion I rarely heard from him. "Everything my grandfather and father built. Everything I've worked for." "I understand that," I said, and part of me did. "But Montgomery Financial's current crisis isn't my doing, Kevin. It's the result of investment decisions made by your father and supported by the executive committee, including you. So you're just going to watch it burn? Maybe help Reynolds? Dismantle it out of spite?" The accusation stung, even though I'd anticipated it. I offered Richard a partnership framework that would preserve Montgomery Financial's independence while implementing necessary reforms, I explained, keeping my voice level despite the rising emotions. "He's discussing it with the board." Kevin was silent for a moment. "And if he refuses? Then Montgomery Financial will face the consequences of its investment decisions and governance structure, just like any other firm would." I paused before adding, "And I'll make business decisions for Wright Capital accordingly." "Just business," he said bitterly. "Like our marriage?" The question cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Our marriage became just business the moment. "You chose your family's approval over supporting my career, Kevin. I heard you in your father's study that night. You guys are right. I don't know how much longer I can keep defending her ideas." His sharp intake of breath told me he remembered those words. I was frustrated, trying to navigate impossible expectations from my family while supporting you. "No, you were choosing sides," I corrected gently. "And you chose wrong." When I returned to Wright Capital, I found Zoe, Marcus, and Taylor waiting with anticipation. "Reynolds made an offer," Marcus guessed from my expression. I nodded, outlining the proposal. "It's aggressive but clean. Montgomery Financial would be absorbed completely, with Wright Capital's methodology as the centerpiece of the reformed investment approach." "And the Montgomerys themselves?" Taylor asked, always focused on the human element. "Reduced to minority shareholders at best, most likely phased out entirely except for Richard in a ceremonial role." The gravity of what we were discussing settled over the room. My small team had formed Wright Capital to implement a sustainable investment vision, not to participate in the dismantling of a 3-generation family legacy. "What do you want to do?" Zoe asked finally. It was the question I'd been wrestling with since my meeting with Victor. What did I want? Vindication. After years of dismissal, the success of my investment methodology, or something more complex, a transformation of Lakefield's financial community toward sustainability and responsible practices. I want to counter-offer, I decided, to both Richard and Victor, a 3-way partnership that preserves Montgomery Financial as an entity, but implements the governance reforms and sustainable practices they need. My team exchanged glances. "That's magnanimous," Marcus observed carefully, "considering how they treated you for years." "It's not about magnanimity," I clarified. "It's about optimal outcomes. Dismantling Montgomery Financial might satisfy some need for justice, but it would be disruptive to clients and the broader financial community. A reformed Montgomery Financial working in concert with Greenlight Capital and with investment from Reynolds could become a model for the industry's evolution. And if Richard refuses? Taylor pressed, voicing the question we were all considering. Then we proceed with Reynolds, and Montgomery Financial faces the market consequences of its decisions. My voice was steady, my resolve clear. This isn't personal. It's the future of finance. That evening, I finally returned home to find Kevin waiting in our living room, a glass of scotch in hand and tension evident in every line of his body. "Dad's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning," he said without greeting. "The Reynolds offer has leaked to several board members." I set down my bag, maintaining the emotional distance that had been growing between us. I suggested a counter-proposal to my team, a three-way partnership that would preserve Montgomery Financial while implementing necessary reforms. Kevin's expression registered surprise, then suspicion. "Why would you do that? You have us cornered." "Because destroying Montgomery Financial doesn't serve anyone's interests in the long run," I explained, pouring myself a glass of water. "Not your clients, not the financial community, and not Greenlight Capital. But you're demanding governance, reforms, outside directors, merit-based leadership rather than family succession." His tone made clear these were Richard's words, not his own interpretation. "Yes," I confirmed, "because those are necessary changes for Montgomery Financial's survival, regardless of whether I'm involved." Kevin set down his glass, studying me with new eyes. "You could destroy everything my family built, partner with Reynolds and absorb our clients and assets, but instead, you're offering a lifeline with conditions." "I'm offering a path forward that benefits everyone," I corrected, "including you, Kevin." "Why?" he asked simply. "After how you've been treated, after what you overheard that night?" I considered the question carefully, examining my own complex motivations. "Because this isn't about revenge. It's about building something better than what exists now. And because despite everything, I believe you and even your father are capable of change when the alternative is extinction." Something shifted in Kevin's expression, a realization that perhaps he hadn't fully understood my character or motivations despite our years together. "I'll convey your counter-proposal to the board tomorrow," he said finally, "for what it's worth." As he stood to leave, heading to the guest bedroom that had increasingly become his primary space, he paused. "I should have defended you. That night, and all the others. I was wrong." The admission hung in the air between us, neither apology nor reconciliation, but perhaps the beginning of something like honest communication. "Yes," I agreed simply. "You were." The next morning brought news that Montgomery Financial's stock had dropped another 15% in pre-market trading as rumors of the Reynolds tender offer circulated among institutional investors. The financial press was running stories about the bellwether exposure, with analysts questioning the judgment of Montgomery's leadership. I arrived at Greenlight Capital early, preparing for what promised to be a pivotal day. Zoe had drafted a formal side counter-proposal to both Montgomery Financial and Reynolds Capital, outlining the three-way partnership structure and governance reforms. "The math works," she confirmed, reviewing the financial models. A reformed Montgomery Financial with Greenlight Capital's methodology and Reynolds Capital could become a market leader in sustainable investment. All three entities benefit more from collaboration than from Montgomery's destruction. Will Richard Montgomery see it that way? Marcus wondered. His entire identity is wrapped up in being the patriarch of Lakefield's premier financial dynasty. His alternatives are limited, I pointed out. The bellwether exposure has created a crisis of confidence. Major clients are already considering withdrawals. Without a convincing narrative about their path forward, Montgomery Financial could face a death spiral. My phone rang, the Montgomery Financial boardroom number. The board meeting must have started, I noted, answering the call. It wasn't Richard or Kevin, but Montgomery Financial's lead independent director, Eleanor Hargrove. Ms. Wright, the board has reviewed your partnership proposal and would like to discuss specific terms. Are you available to join our meeting in person? Eleanor's involvement was significant. As the only non-family board member with significant influence, her support would be crucial for any major restructuring. I can be there in 20 minutes, I confirmed. As I gathered my materials, Taylor handed me a folder containing additional data on Montgomery Financial's market position and client relationships. For leverage, she explained. Their top 15 institutional clients represent 60% of their managed assets. 3 have already expressed interest in Greenlight Capital's approach based on yesterday's launch. Armed with data and resolve, I walked the short distance to Montgomery Financial's headquarters, the glass tower that had once seemed so intimidating now appearing vulnerable in the morning light. The security guard who had often made me wait for visitor clearance now rushed to escort me directly to the boardroom on the top floor. The shift in treatment was as revealing as it was ironic. The boardroom doors opened to reveal the complete Montgomery Financial board, 8 members including Richard, Andrew, and Jessica, along with 5 outside directors who had historically deferred to Richard's leadership. Kevin sat separately, not a board member, but present as a senior executive. All eyes turned to me as I entered. Ms. Wright, Eleanor Hargrove rose to greet me. Thank you for joining us during this critical discussion. We've reviewed your partnership proposal and agree there's potential merit in a collaborative approach rather than a hostile acquisition. Richard's expression was carefully neutral, though the tension in his jaw suggested internal conflict. Andrew looked openly hostile, while Jessica maintained a calculating assessment. Kevin's eyes held a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't fully interpret. Before we proceed, Eleanor continued, the board would like to understand your specific requirements regarding governance reforms and leadership succession. These are, understandably, sensitive topics for a family-founded institution like Montgomery Financial. I set my materials on the table, aware that this moment represented a fundamental power shift in a firm that had been Montgomery-controlled for 3 generations. My requirements are straightforward, I began. Montgomery Financial requires a modern governance structure appropriate to its size and market position. That means a board comprising a majority of truly independent directors with relevant expertise, executive leadership selected on merit rather than family connection, and investment decisions guided by forward-looking methodologies rather than historical precedent. Andrew's face flushed with anger. You're demanding we surrender control of our own firm after one investment setback. I'm suggesting Montgomery Financial evolve beyond a family office mentality, I corrected calmly. And Bellwether isn't one investment setback. It represents a fundamental failure of risk assessment and portfolio diversification. Your clients are questioning the judgment that led to concentrating 40% of managed assets in a sector with clear regulatory and market headwinds. What assurance do we have that your sustainable investment methodology actually works? Jessica challenged. Beyond backtesting and theoretical models? It was a fair question, if belated. Greenlight Capital conducted extensive due diligence before investing $10 million for a minority stake in Greenlight Capital. Their risk assessment team validated both the historical performance and forward projections. But more importantly, the events of the past 72 hours have demonstrated precisely what my models predicted: that companies with poor environmental practices face increasing regulatory risk that eventually translates to financial consequences. Eleanor Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. Ms. Wright's methodology anticipated the bellwether situation, while our traditional analysis missed key warning signs. That fact alone warrants serious consideration of her approach. Richard finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone confronting the end of an era. The partnership structure you're proposing, Montgomery Financial remains independent, but implements governance reforms. Greenlight Capital provides investment methodology, and Reynolds Capital contributes additional investment to stabilize our position. Is that correct? Yes, I confirmed. All three entities benefit more from collaboration than from destruction. Montgomery Financial maintains its brand and client relationships. Wright Capital's methodology gains market validation and scale, and Reynolds achieves growth without the disruption of a hostile takeover. And our roles? Andrew asked directly. The family's position? Here was the crux of the matter. The Montgomery family's identity and status had been synonymous with their firm for generations. Board composition would shift to a majority of independent directors, with Richard maintaining the chairman position for a transition period. Executive leadership would be evaluated on merit, with current executives, including family members, having the opportunity to demonstrate their value in a reformed structure. The implication was clear. Andrew and Jessica would need to prove their worth beyond their last name. Their expressions suggested they understood precisely what this meant. Kevin spoke for the first time. And Reynolds? What's preventing them from taking control once they have a significant ownership stake? Protective governance provisions, I explained. Reynolds would receive preferred shares with limited voting rights, specifically structured to prevent creeping control. The partnership agreement would include clear protections for Montgomery Financial's independence. Eleanor turned to the other independent directors. These terms, while requiring significant change, offer a path forward that preserves the firm's independence while addressing the governance concerns that contributed to our current vulnerability. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, diving into specific governance provisions, board composition, leadership evaluation criteria, and implementation timelines. Throughout, I maintained a professional detachment, focusing on optimal business outcomes rather than personal history. Finally, Eleanor called for a brief recess to allow the board to confer privately. As I waited in an adjacent conference room, Kevin joined me, his expression thoughtful. "You could have helped Reynolds dismantle us," he said quietly. "After everything, that might have been justified. I studied him. This man I had married with such hope and whose family had systematically undermined my professional contributions for years. Destroying Montgomery Financial wouldn't undo the past, Kevin, and it wouldn't serve my vision for how financial services should evolve." "The board is going to accept your terms," he said after a moment, "with some modifications to the timeline, but the substance will remain. Richard recognizes that the alternative is worse." "And you?" I asked. "What do you recognize?" Kevin met my gaze directly, more honest than he'd been in years. "That I failed you. That I chose the wrong side in a conflict I didn't fully understand. That my father's approach, our family's approach, was fundamentally flawed in ways I couldn't see until crisis forced me to look." It wasn't an apology or a reconciliation. Those would require much more than a moment of clarity. But it was an acknowledgement of truths long denied. "The board is ready to continue," the assistant announced from the doorway. As we returned to the boardroom, I realized that regardless of the board's decision, something fundamental had already changed. The Montgomery dynasty that had seemed untouchable was being forced to evolve. The investment approach I had championed against years of dismissal was now recognized as visionary rather than naive. Most importantly, I had found my own power not in destruction or revenge, but in creation, building, something valuable enough to transform the very institutions that had once dismissed me. That transformation was just beginning, with consequences that would reshape Lakefield's financial landscape for generations to come. The Montgomery Financial boardroom fell silent as Eleanor Hargrove announced the board's decision. "We've voted to accept the partnership framework Ms. Wright has proposed, with minor modifications to implementation timelines and specific governance provisions." Richard Montgomery's expression remained carefully neutral, though I could see the muscle tightening in his jaw, the same tell he'd displayed during our previous confrontations. The acknowledgement must have been physically painful for him. "The board recognizes," Eleanor continued, her calm voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades in corporate governance, "that Montgomery Financial requires significant structural changes to address the challenges revealed by the bellwether situation. Ms. Wright's methodology offers a path forward that preserves our independence while modernizing our approach." Andrew couldn't maintain his father's composure. "This is nothing short of extortion," he snapped, his face flushed. "Using a temporary market disruption to force fundamental changes to a firm that has operated successfully for 70 years. Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Montgomery, the board disagrees with your characterization. A 40% exposure to a single sector facing criminal charges is not a temporary market disruption. It represents a catastrophic failure of risk management, one that occurred under the current governance structure." I remained silent, letting the board's internal dynamics play out. This wasn't my victory to claim. It was Montgomery Financial's necessary evolution. "The partnership agreement will require final approval from all three parties," Eleanor continued. "Ms. Wright, how soon can you arrange a meeting with Victor Reynolds to discuss the modified terms?" "I'll contact him immediately," I replied. Though I should note that his original offer was for acquisition, not partnership. The three-way structure will require significant recalibration of expectations. Richard spoke for the first time since the vote, his voice carrying the weight of forced adaptation. "I'll speak with Victor directly. We've been competitors for 30 years, but we understand each other's position in this community." The implied message was clear. Financial titans should negotiate directly, without intermediaries like me. I might have bristled at this 6 months ago, but now I simply nodded. "Of course, though Wright Capital's participation remains contingent on the governance reforms we've outlined." As the meeting concluded, Kevin caught my eye across the table, his expression a complex mixture of professional concern and personal uncertainty. The boundary between our marriage and our business relationship had never been more blurred. In the elevator descending from Montgomery Financial's executive floor, Eleanor Hargrove surprised me by pressing the stop button between floors. "That was well played," she said without preamble, offering a lifeline with conditions rather than supporting Reynolds's hostile takeover. I studied her carefully. At 62, Eleanor had navigated the male-dominated world of corporate finance for decades before joining Montgomery Financial's board. Her assessment carried weight beyond the boardroom. "It wasn't a strategic ploy," I clarified. "A reformed Montgomery Financial serves the market better than one dismantled by hostile acquisition." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps. But you've also positioned Wright Capital perfectly regardless of the outcome. If the partnership proceeds, your methodology becomes central to one of Lakefield's premier institutions. If it fails, Reynolds will likely pursue the acquisition with your support, giving you similar influence plus the satisfaction of seeing the Montgomerys removed." Her assessment was accurate, if more calculating than my conscious strategy. "The Montgomerys built something valuable," I acknowledged. "My issue was never with the institution itself, but with its resistance to necessary evolution." Eleanor released the elevator button, allowing our descent to continue. "Richard doesn't understand that yet, but he will, or the institution will, move forward without him." As the doors opened to the lobby, she added, "For what it's worth, I reviewed your sustainable growth models 3 years ago when you first presented them. I voted for implementation then. I was outvoted by the family block." This small revelation, that at least one voice on the board had recognized the value of my work years before, provided unexpected validation as I walked back to Wright Capital's offices. Zoe was waiting expectantly, with Marcus and Taylor hovering nearby, pretending to work while obviously awaiting news. "They accepted," I confirmed, setting down my portfolio on our conference table. "With modifications to implementation timelines, but the core governance reforms remain intact." The Montgomerys actually agreed to relinquish control? Marcus asked incredulously. After 3 generations? They recognized the alternative was worse, I explained. Richard will remain as chairman during a transition period, but the board will shift to a majority of independent directors, and executive positions will be evaluated on merit rather than family connection. And Reynolds Capital, Taylor prompted. Are they on board with partnership instead of acquisition? Richard is speaking with Victor directly, I said, noting their surprised expressions. Yes, I know. Traditional power structures reasserting themselves. But the outcome matters more than who negotiates it. As my team digested these developments, my phone rang. Kevin. Can we talk? He asked without greeting. Not here. Somewhere neutral. We agreed to meet at Riverside Park, the small green space along Lakefield's modest waterfront. It was early afternoon when I arrived, finding Kevin already seated on a bench overlooking the water. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, small rebellions against the Montgomery dress code that suggested his state of mind. Eleanor says you saved the firm, he said as I sat beside him, maintaining a careful distance. That the partnership structure you proposed preserves the Montgomery legacy while implementing necessary reforms. The firm was salvageable, I replied, despite the bellwether exposure. Kevin stared out at the water, his profile sharp against the spring sunlight. Dad doesn't see it that way. He says you exploited a temporary vulnerability to stage what amounts to a coup. That's not surprising, I acknowledged. Richard built his identity around absolute control of Montgomery Financial. Sharing power feels like surrender to him. He wanted me to convince you to modify the governance provisions, Kevin continued, to maintain family control of the board and executive committee. I turned to face him directly. And what did you tell him? Kevin met my gaze, something shifting in his expression. That you were right. That the bellwether disaster happened. Precisely because we operated as a family office despite managing $30 billion in client assets. That real accountability requires independent oversight. His answer surprised me. For 5 years, Kevin had navigated the uncomfortable middle ground between supporting me privately while deferring to his family publicly. This direct challenge to his father's perspective represented a significant evolution. He didn't take it well, Kevin added with a hollow laugh. Said I was choosing my wife over my heritage, as if those should be in opposition. They never should have been, I agreed quietly. But your family made them so from the beginning. We sat in silence, for a moment the weight of 5 years of accumulated tensions hanging between us. Finally, Kevin spoke again, his voice different, more vulnerable than I'd heard since our early days together. I failed you, Elena. Not just that night you overheard us in Dad's study, but every day I didn't stand up for your ideas, your expertise, your vision. I told myself I was navigating a complex family dynamic, but really, I was just being a coward. The admission hung in the air, neither of us certain what it meant for our future. A relationship damaged by years of small betrayals couldn't be repaired with a single moment of clarity, no matter how sincere. What happens now? I asked, deliberately leaving the question open to both personal and professional interpretations. Kevin seemed to understand the dual nature of my question. Professionally, the partnership negotiations will move forward. Dad and Victor had a preliminary conversation this afternoon, surprisingly productive according to Eleanor. They're scheduling a formal meeting with all parties for tomorrow. He hesitated before continuing. Personally, I don't know, Elena. I want to believe we can rebuild what's been damaged, but I understand if that's not possible. The vulnerability in his voice stirred emotions I'd been carefully containing for months. I don't know either, I admitted. Too much has happened to return to what we were, and I'm not sure that relationship was ever as equal as I wanted to believe. Kevin nodded slowly, accepting this difficult truth. Would you be open to trying something new then? Not returning to our old patterns, but building something different? Something where I actually show up as your partner? It was a question that deserved careful consideration rather than an emotional response. I need time, I said finally. The next few weeks will transform both our professional worlds. Let's navigate that first, then reassess our personal relationship with clearer perspectives. As we parted ways, Kevin returning to Montgomery Financial, me to Wright Capital, I felt the first tentative possibility that our relationship might evolve rather than simply end. Whether that evolution would lead to reconciliation or amicable separation remained uncertain. Back at Wright Capital, Zoe had news of her own. Naomi Chen called from Greenlight. The Reynolds-Montgomery negotiations have hit the financial press. She wants to know if this changes our capital structure or independence. This was an important concern. Greenlight had invested in Wright Capital as an independent entity, not as a cog in a larger financial machine. Arrange a call, I requested. Our independence remains non-negotiable in any partnership structure, but Naomi deserves to hear that directly from me. The call with Naomi Chen, scheduled for later that afternoon, proved to be another exercise in navigating complex motivations and power dynamics. Naomi had built Greenlight Capital into a force in sustainable investing through strategic foresight and unwavering principles. The market is interpreting this as Montgomery Financial acquiring your methodology, she began without preamble, her direct style unchanged since our first meeting years earlier, which would represent a significant deviation from the independent growth strategy we invested in. The market's interpretation is incorrect, I assured her. The partnership structure explicitly preserves Wright Capital's independence. We license our methodology to the reformed Montgomery Reynolds entity, but maintain our separate operations and client relationships. Naomi's skepticism was evident even through the phone. Richard Montgomery has spent 30 years absorbing or eliminating threats to his market position. Why would he accept a partnership that diminishes his control while empowering the very person whose ideas he dismissed for years? It was a fair question, one that had occurred to me repeatedly since the board meeting. Because his alternatives are worse, I explained. The bellwether exposure created a crisis of confidence that threatens the firm's survival. My methodology provides a credible narrative for their path forward, while the partnership with Reynolds offers financial stabilization they urgently need. And when the crisis passes, Naomi pressed, when Montgomery Financial stabilizes under your methodology and Reynolds' capital, what prevents them from attempting to absorb Wright Capital completely or develop competing approaches internally? Again, her concern was valid. Success could breed exactly the kind of overconfidence that had led to Montgomery Financial's current vulnerability. The partnership agreement includes explicit protections for Wright Capital's independence, I detailed, including non-compete clauses, intellectual property protections, and financial penalties for any attempt to replicate our methodology internally. Additionally, the governance reforms ensure decisions will require approval from independent directors, not just the Montgomery family. Naomi was silent for a moment, considering these provisions. Send me the draft partnership terms, she requested finally. Greenlight's counsel will review them. Our investment was in your vision, Elena, both your investment methodology and your approach to building a different kind of financial institution. We want to ensure that vision isn't compromised by this arrangement. The conversation reinforced the complexity of the position I'd created, balancing Wright Capital's independence with the transformative potential of the three-way partnership. Maintaining this balance would require constant vigilance against the traditional power dynamics that had dominated Lakefield's financial community for generations. As evening fell, I returned home to an empty house. Kevin had texted that he would be working late at Montgomery Financial, preparing materials for the partnership negotiations. The space that had once been our shared life now felt like a museum of a relationship preserved in amber. unchanged while both of us had evolved beyond recognition. I poured a glass of wine and settled on our back deck, reviewing the draft partnership agreement Eleanor had sent over. The formal document translated our conceptual framework into legal provisions: board composition requirements, executive evaluation criteria, methodology licensing terms, capital contributions from Reynolds, client retention incentives, and dozens of other provisions that would reshape 3 financial institutions. My phone rang. Sophia Lynn, whose strategic insight had helped shape my approach to the Montgomery crisis. "I hear you're rewriting Lakefield's financial landscape," she began, a note of approval in her voice. "A 3-way partnership instead of a hostile takeover, elegant and unexpected." "News travels fast," I observed. "The terms aren't even finalized yet." "In financial circles, rumors move at the speed of opportunity," Sophia replied. "Victor Reynolds is telling selected contacts that the partnership represents the future of sustainable investing in regional markets. Richard Montgomery is assuring nervous clients that the arrangement strengthens their position while modernizing their approach." She paused before adding, "Everyone's spinning this to serve their narrative." "And what's your assessment?" I asked, valuing her objective perspective. "That you've achieved something remarkable," she said simply. "Not just salvaging your investment methodology from years of Montgomery dismissal, but positioning it as the cornerstone of Lakefield's financial evolution. That's no small feat for someone they were relegating to client relations 18 months ago." Her validation meant more than she likely realized. Throughout my career, I'd sought not just success, but meaningful impact. The opportunity to demonstrate that financial returns and responsible practices could coexist and even reinforce each other. "There's still significant resistance," I acknowledged, "particularly from Andrew and Jessica. They see the governance reforms as a direct threat to their positions." "Because they are," Sophia noted bluntly. "Neither would survive a merit-based evaluation of their contributions. Andrew's risk management failures with Bellwether alone would disqualify him from leadership in a properly governed institution." She wasn't wrong. Andrew had championed the increasing concentration in Bellwether despite emerging regulatory concerns, dismissing environmental compliance issues as political noise rather than material risks. Jessica had focused primarily on maintaining the firm's traditional image rather than adapting to changing client expectations around sustainable investing. "The partnership meeting tomorrow will be challenging," I said, thinking ahead to the formal negotiations with all parties present. "Richard will attempt to modify the governance provisions to preserve family influence. Victor will push for greater control than the partnership framework allows. And I need to maintain right capital's independence while ensuring the methodology implementation is done correctly." "You're well positioned," Sophia reassured me. "All parties need what you're offering more than you need their validation. Remember that when the pressure increases." After we disconnected, I continued reviewing the partnership documents, making detailed notes on provisions that required strengthening or clarification. The intellectual property protections for Right Capital's methodology needed expansion. The implementation timeline for governance reforms should be accelerated. The metrics for evaluating executive performance required more specific ESG components. I was still working when I heard the front door open well after midnight. Kevin appeared in the doorway to the deck, his tie completely gone now, his usually immaculate appearance showing the strain of the day's events. "Thought you'd be asleep," he said, hesitating at the threshold as if uncertain of his welcome in what had once been unquestionably his home. "Preparing for tomorrow," I explained, gesturing to the documents spread across the table. "The partnership. Terms need refinement." He nodded, coming to stand at the deck railing, maintaining a careful distance. "Dad's doing the same, though his focus is on preserving family influence rather than ensuring proper governance." "Not surprising," I acknowledged. Richard built Montgomery Financial around his personal vision and authority, Sharing power doesn't come naturally to him. Kevin was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkened garden. "He offered me Andrew's position today," he said finally. "Chief Risk Officer, assuming Andrew transitions to a strategic advisory role without portfolio responsibilities." The revelation was significant. Richard was already making personnel changes in anticipation of the partnership's merit-based leadership evaluations, sacrificing Andrew to preserve Kevin's position and, by extension, the Montgomery family's continued influence. "What did you tell him?" I asked carefully. Kevin turned to face me, his expression troubled but resolute. "That I wouldn't accept any position that wasn't earned through proper evaluation against external candidates. That the era of family appointments needs to end for Montgomery Financial to regain credibility." His answer surprised me, a clean break from the dynastic expectations that had shaped his career and our relationship. That couldn't have gone over well. "It didn't," he confirmed with a rueful smile. "Dad said I was betraying the family legacy. Jessica suggested I was trying to curry favor with you at the expense of Montgomery solidarity." He shrugged slightly. "Maybe they're right. But for the first time since this crisis began, I feel like I'm making decisions based on principles rather than expectations." The moment felt significant, a glimpse of the partner I'd thought I was marrying 5 years earlier, before the Montgomery family culture had subsumed his individual judgment. Whether this evolution had come too late for our marriage remained an open question, but it represented genuine growth regardless. "Get some rest," I suggested gently. "Tomorrow we'll reshape all our professional futures one way or another." The next morning dawned bright and clear, as if the natural world were indifferent to the power struggles unfolding in Lakefield's financial district. I dressed with particular care, selecting a tailored charcoal suit that projected authority, without the conservative styling favored by Montgomery Financial's female executives. This negotiation would occur on neutral ground, literally and figuratively. The partnership meeting was scheduled at Lakefield's Commerce Center, a neutral venue selected by mutual agreement. As I arrived with Zoe and our legal counsel, Susan Chen, no relation to Naomi but equally formidable in her field, I noted the careful choreography of the arriving parties. Victor Reynolds entered with his CFO and general counsel, his customary confidence evident in his stride and handshake as he greeted various participants. The Reynolds Capital contingent exuded the energy of predators scenting opportunity, barely concealing their focus on Montgomery Financial's vulnerability. Richard Montgomery arrived with Kevin, Andrew, Jessica, and Eleanor Hargrove, a composition that spoke volumes about power dynamics within Montgomery Financial. By including Eleanor, Richard acknowledged the board's authority in this negotiation, rather than treating it as a family decision. By bringing all 3 of his children, he signaled the Montgomery dynasty's continued relevance despite the proposed governance changes. The conference room was arranged with 3 distinct sections: Montgomery Financial, Reynolds Capital, and Wright Capital, positioned at equal distances around the circular table. The symbolic equality was not lost on anyone, particularly given the vast differences in size and history among the 3 institutions. Victor Reynolds opened the proceedings with characteristic directness. "We're here to negotiate a transformative partnership that will reshape Lakefield's financial landscape. Reynolds Capital brings financial strength and market position. Montgomery Financial contributes institutional history and client relationships. Wright Capital provides the sustainable investment methodology that will differentiate our combined approach in an evolving market." He glanced at Richard. "Have I characterized our positions accurately?" Richard nodded stiffly, his expression carefully neutral. "With the caveat that Montgomery Financial remains independent under the proposed structure, with its own board, management, and client relationships." "Independence within a collaborative framework," Victor agreed smoothly. "Now, let's address the governance provisions that form the foundation of this partnership." What followed was a master class in high-stakes negotiation. Richard Montgomery, despite his firm's vulnerable position, deployed decades of experience to resist the most significant governance changes while appearing to embrace the partnership concept. Victor Reynolds pressed for greater influence over the combined entity's direction, while maintaining the pretense of respecting Montgomery Financial's independence. And I found myself in the unexpected position of mediator between these competing visions, advocating for governance reforms that would serve client interests rather than institutional egos. The proposed board composition unnecessarily dilutes family representation, Richard argued, addressing a key provision that would limit Montgomery family members to 3 of 11 board positions. The Montgomery name and reputation are central to client confidence. Removing family leadership sends the wrong message during an already uncertain time. The bellwether exposure occurred under family leadership, Victor countered smoothly. Client confidence requires demonstrable change, not cosmetic adjustments to the same governance structure that created the current vulnerability. Before Richard could respond with what would undoubtedly be an escalating argument, I intervened. What if we modified the provision to guarantee 3 Montgomery family board positions, but implement a staggered evaluation process for all executive roles based on objective performance metrics? This preserves family representation at the governance level, while ensuring operational leadership is based on merit rather than name. Eleanor Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. This approach maintains the core principle of merit-based leadership, while acknowledging the Montgomery family's legitimate role in the institution's identity. It seems a reasonable compromise. The negotiation continued in this pattern through dozens of provisions. Richard protecting family influence, Victor pushing for greater control, and Wright Capital advocating for governance structures that would ensure sustainable practices became central rather than peripheral to the combined entity's operations. By mid-afternoon, the framework of an agreement had emerged. Montgomery Financial would remain independent, but implement comprehensive governance reforms, including a majority independent board and merit-based executive evaluation. Reynolds Capital would provide significant capital investment in exchange for preferred shares with limited voting rights. Wright Capital would license its sustainable investment methodology exclusively to the partnership while maintaining its separate operations and client relationships. As the lawyers began drafting the formal agreement based on the negotiated terms, Richard requested a brief recess. "I'd like to speak with Ms. Wright privately," he said, his tone making clear this wasn't a casual conversation. We stepped into an adjacent conference room, the first time we'd been truly alone since the crisis began. Richard studied me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between grudging respect and lingering resentment. "You've orchestrated this outcome from the beginning," he said finally. "From the moment you heard about Bellwether's vulnerabilities, you've been positioning Wright Capital to capitalize on Montgomery Financial's temporary setback." I met his gaze directly. "That's not accurate, Richard. I developed my sustainable investment methodology years before Bellwether's issues emerged. I attempted to implement it at Montgomery Financial 3 separate times and was dismissed each time. The current situation simply revealed the consequences of that dismissal." He waved away this history with an impatient gesture. "The partnership, terms as negotiated, will fundamentally alter the character of Montgomery Financial. 3 generations of family leadership replaced by committee governance and outsider influence. The partnership terms will strengthen Montgomery Financial's ability to serve clients effectively in a changing market," I corrected. "Family leadership has tremendous value when it embraces evolution rather than resisting it." Richard's expression hardened. "My father built this firm from nothing. I expanded it tenfold. We didn't need outside directors or governance consultants telling us how to succeed. Different eras require different approaches," I said simply. "The financial world your father navigated bears little resemblance to today's markets. Client expectations have evolved. Regulatory frameworks have tightened. Information asymmetries have collapsed. What worked for previous generations of Montgomery leadership simply isn't sufficient for current challenges. Something shifted in Richard's expression. Not acceptance, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of recognition. You genuinely believe this partnership serves Montgomery Financial's interests better than the status quo? It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. I do. And more importantly, it serves your client's interests better. That should be the only consideration that matters. Richard studied me for a long moment. Kevin says the same thing. That we lost sight of client interests while protecting family prerogatives. He shook his head slightly. Perhaps I raised him too well after all. The comment revealed more about Richard's perspective than he likely intended, the conflation of family loyalty with business judgment that had characterized Montgomery Financial's approach for generations. Kevin has the potential to be an exceptional leader, I said carefully. But that potential can only be realized in an environment where merit matters more than name. Richard's smile was thin but genuine. You always did see him more clearly than I did. He straightened his already immaculate tie, a gesture I recognized as his preparation to return to the negotiation. The partnership will proceed on the terms we've outlined. But make no mistake, Elena. This transformation you've initiated will have consequences beyond governance structures and investment methodologies. For all of us. As we returned to the main conference room, I reflected on Richard's parting statement. He was right about one thing. The partnership we were creating would reshape not just our professional lives, but our personal relationships as well. The Montgomery family dynamics, my marriage to Kevin, the social structures of Lakefield's financial community, all would evolve in ways we couldn't fully anticipate. The formal partnership agreement was signed late that evening, with representatives from all three entities witnessing what the financial press would later call the most significant restructuring of regional financial power in a generation. Richard Montgomery, Victor Reynolds, and I stood together for photographs that would appear in the next day's business section, an image of collaboration that masked the complex negotiations and power struggles behind the smiling facades. As the gathering dispersed, Kevin approached me, his expression suggesting he had news beyond the partnership signing. Andrew resigned, he said quietly. Effective immediately, he's taking a position with a family office in Boston. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising. Andrew had been the most vocal opponent of the governance reforms, and his role in the bellwether exposure made his position particularly vulnerable under the new merit-based evaluation system. And Jessica? I asked, knowing the siblings had always moved in tandem through Montgomery Financial's hierarchy. Negotiating a strategic advisor role with reduced responsibilities, Kevin confirmed. Dad convinced her it was better to accept a modified position than risk complete removal under the new structure. The Montgomery dynasty was adapting, even as its traditional power was diminished. And you? I asked, the question encompassing both his professional position and our personal relationship. Kevin's expression softened slightly. Professionally, I've requested a full evaluation against external candidates for any leadership role. No family exceptions. He hesitated before adding, personally, I was hoping we might have dinner tonight. Not to resolve everything, just to talk without the pressure of partnership negotiations hanging over us. It was a small request, but symbolically significant. A return to basic communication without predetermined expectations. I'd like that, I agreed. Though I should warn you, I may fall asleep in my soup after the last 72 hours. His smile was tentative, but real. That makes two of us. As we left the Commerce Center together, I noticed Richard watching us from across the lobby, his expression unreadable. The patriarch of Lakefield's premier financial dynasty was witnessing the beginning of an era he hadn't designed and couldn't control. Whether he would ultimately adapt to this new reality or resist it remained to be seen. But the transformation had already begun. For Montgomery Financial, for Wright Capital, and for the family relationships that had once seemed immutable. The partnership we'd created represented more than a business arrangement. It symbolized a fundamental shift in how value and authority were determined in Lakefield's financial community, away from hereditary control and toward merit-based leadership, away from resistance to change and toward strategic adaptation, away from dismissing new voices and toward incorporating diverse perspectives. For 5 years, I had been the outsider challenging Montgomery Financial's approach from a position of institutional weakness. Now, through a combination of preparation, perception, and well-timed action, I had helped reshape the very institution that had once dismissed my contributions. Not through destruction or conquest, but through transformation, creating a structure that preserved what was valuable while reforming what was flawed. As Kevin and I walked through Lakefield's financial district toward the restaurant he'd suggested, I reflected on the parallel journeys of our professional and personal relationships. Both had begun with optimism, suffered through dismissal and disillusionment, and now stood at a point of potential renewal, not returning to what was, but possibly evolving into something more balanced and sustainable. Whether that evolution would succeed remained uncertain, but the possibility itself represented a victory I couldn't have imagined when I first overheard those dismissive comments in Richard's study. The path forward would be complex and challenging, but for the first time in years, it felt like a path of my own design, rather than one constrained by Montgomery expectations and limitations. In the warm spring evening, with Lakefield's financial district behind us, and an uncertain, but potentially promising future ahead, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction, not in having defeated the Montgomerys or proven my superiority, but in having created something valuable enough to transform the very institutions and relationships that had once seemed immovably arrayed against me. That transformation was just beginning, with consequences that would reshape our professional and personal landscapes in ways we were only beginning to comprehend. 5 years later, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Lakefield Financial Center, looking out at the gathered faces of the entire regional financial community. The annual Sustainable Finance Awards had become the premier industry event in our region, and as founder of Wright Capital, I had been asked to deliver the keynote address for the 5th consecutive year. When we talk about transformation in financial services, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. We often focus on technological disruption, regulatory changes, or market shifts. But the most profound transformation occurs when institutions evolve their fundamental understanding of value creation itself. From my vantage point, I could see familiar faces throughout the audience. Victor Reynolds sat at a front table, now semi-retired but still chairman of Reynolds Capital, which had tripled in size since our partnership began. Eleanor Hargrove nodded encouragingly from her table, having guided Montgomery Financial's governance evolution with steady wisdom. Zoe, Marcus, and Taylor occupied Wright Capital's designated table, joined by our expanded research team that now included 15 specialists across various sustainability domains. 5 years ago, the financial community in Lakefield faced what appeared to be an existential choice, I continued. Preserve traditional approaches at the cost of addressing emerging risks, or dismantle established institutions in favor of completely new models. What we discovered through our partnership was a more powerful alternative. Transformative evolution that preserved institutional strengths while reforming what no longer served market realities. In the center of the room sat Kevin, now firmly established as Montgomery Financial's CEO, having earned the role through performance rather than inheritance. Our eyes met briefly, his slight smile acknowledging the journey that had brought us to this moment, professionally and personally. The numbers tell a compelling story, I noted, advancing to the next slide in my presentation. Since implementing sustainable investment methodologies, The combined assets under management across our regional partnership have grown from $42 billion to $97 billion. Risk-adjusted returns have outperformed traditional benchmarks by an average of 3.2 percentage points annually. Client retention has increased from 82% to 97%, with net positive inflows every quarter. These metrics validated what had once been dismissed as idealistic theory, that sustainable investment approaches could deliver superior financial performance while addressing environmental and social considerations. The methodology Greenlight Capital had developed, once mocked at Montgomery family dinner parties, was now the foundation of the region's most successful investment approach. But numbers alone don't capture the true transformation, I continued. The real evolution occurred in our understanding of how financial institutions create lasting value, not through short-term extraction, but through long-term alignment with emerging realities. Not through concentration of authority, but through inclusive governance that incorporates diverse perspectives. Not through rigid preservation of tradition, but through thoughtful evolution that honors heritage while embracing necessary change. From his table near the side of the room, I noticed Richard Montgomery watching with an expression I had once thought impossible: genuine respect. In the 5 years since our partnership began, he had gradually transitioned from resistance to acceptance, and eventually to advocacy for the governance reforms that had transformed Montgomery Financial. His evolution might have been the most surprising of all. From patriarch defending absolute control to elder statesman championing institutional adaptation. The most important lesson of our journey is that transformation doesn't require destruction, I emphasized, reaching the core message of my address. The false choice between preservation and disruption overlooks the most powerful alternative: evolutionary change that builds on legitimate strengths while reforming what no longer serves. This approach creates more value, more sustainably, than either rigid tradition or chaotic disruption. As I concluded my remarks to enthusiastic applause, I reflected on how completely Lakefield's financial landscape had been reshaped in the years since our partnership began. Montgomery Financial had evolved from family fiefdom to modern institution, maintaining its heritage while implementing governance reforms that ensured merit-based leadership and sustainable investment principles. Reynolds Capital had achieved strategic growth without the disruption of hostile acquisitions, expanding its market presence while incorporating forward-looking methodologies. Wright Capital had grown from fledgling startup to respected industry leader, our methodology now licensed to financial institutions across 12 regional markets nationwide. The transition from the podium to mingling with attendees brought me face-to-face with Camila Torres, who had documented our partnership's evolution from skeptical journalist to respected financial analyst. Your keynote captured the essence of what makes Lakefield's approach unique, she observed. This model of collaborative evolution rather than competitive disruption is attracting attention far beyond regional markets. I've had inquiries from national publications about featuring the partnership as a case study in financial reformation. The framework is replicable precisely because it balances preservation with necessary change, I noted. Institutions don't have to choose between maintaining their heritage and addressing emerging realities. The most successful approach integrates both perspectives. As Camila moved on to interview other industry leaders, I found myself approached by a young woman I recognized as a recent hire at Montgomery Financial, part of their expanded sustainable investment team. Ms. Wright, your methodology has completely transformed how we approach client portfolios, she said with the enthusiasm of early career conviction. When I interviewed at traditional firms in New York, they were still treating ESG factors as marketing overlays rather than material financial considerations. Montgomery's integrated approach is years ahead of the curve. Her perspective highlighted another dimension of our partnership's impact, creating career opportunities for professionals committed to sustainable finance who might otherwise have been marginalized in traditional institutions. Throughout Lakefield's financial community, A new generation of analysts and advisors was implementing approaches that balanced financial returns with environmental and social considerations, no longer forced to choose between values and career advancement. As the evening progressed into the awards presentation, I found myself seated next to Eleanor Hargrove, whose guidance as lead independent director had been instrumental in Montgomery Financial's governance evolution. Richard is retiring completely. Next month, she informed me quietly as we applauded a young analyst receiving recognition for innovative climate risk modeling, stepping down as chairman and transferring his remaining shares to a family foundation focused on sustainable community development. Quite a transformation from the man who once equated absolute control with successful leadership. The news represented the final chapter in Montgomery Financial's governance reformation. Complete transition from family dominance to professional management and independent oversight. How is he handling the transition? I asked, genuinely curious about Richard's psychological adjustment to this final relinquishment of control. Eleanor's smile conveyed both surprise and satisfaction. With unexpected grace, he seems to have made peace with the reality that his legacy depends on successful adaptation rather than rigid preservation. Kevin's leadership success has certainly helped with that acceptance. Speaking of Kevin, I noticed him approaching our table as the awards portion of the evening concluded and attendees began circulating more freely. His confidence as institutional leader had fully matured over the 5 years since our partnership began, no longer seeking validation through family approval or hierarchical position, but grounded in demonstrated capacity to guide Montgomery Financial through necessary evolution while preserving its core strengths. "Congratulations on the Outstanding Leadership Award," he said, taking the seat Eleanor vacated as she moved to speak with other attendees. "Your keynote perfectly captured what made our partnership succeed when so many institutional transformations fail." The balanced approach was key, I acknowledged, preserving what worked while reforming what didn't, something we all contributed to in different ways. Kevin nodded thoughtfully. 5 years ago, I couldn't have imagined Montgomery Financial not only surviving the bellwether disaster, but emerging stronger through governance reform and sustainable methodology implementation. Most institutions facing similar crises either collapse or retreat to rigid preservation of flawed approaches. His observation highlighted the exceptional nature of our partnership's outcomes, transformation that strengthened rather than weakened the institutions involved, evolution that served client interests more effectively than either disruption or stagnation could have achieved. Our conversation paused as Victor Reynolds joined us, his characteristically direct manner unchanged despite his semi-retired status. The numbers for the expanded regional partnership exceeded projections again last quarter, he noted without preamble, particularly in the mid-market institutional segment that traditional approaches were consistently underserving. The methodology scales efficiently across markets with similar characteristics, I confirmed, particularly when local institutions maintain their client relationships while implementing the sustainable framework. This had proven to be the most powerful aspect of our partnership model, preserving local institutions' client relationships and market knowledge while upgrading their investment methodology and governance practices. Rather than displacing regional financial firms, our approach strengthened them through collaborative evolution, creating more value than competitive disruption could have generated. As the evening concluded and attendees began dispersing into Lakefield's pleasant summer evening, I found myself walking with Kevin toward the terrace overlooking the riverfront. The city's financial district stretched along the waterfront, historic buildings now interspersed with modern, sustainable architecture, physical manifestation of the balanced evolution our partnership had championed. Hard to believe it's been 5 years since those emergency board meetings and crisis negotiations, Kevin observed, the evening breeze slightly ruffling his hair as we looked out over the illuminated skyline. Sometimes I still expect to wake up and find myself back in that desperate scramble after the bellwether collapse. The The partnership succeeded because the crisis created space for necessary evolution, I noted. Sometimes institutions need external pressure to overcome internal resistance to change, even when that change ultimately serves their long-term interests. Kevin's smile held both recognition and a hint of something more personal. True of individuals as well as institutions, I needed that crisis to recognize how completely my judgment had been compromised by family expectations and institutional hierarchy. His acknowledgement reflected the parallel journeys of professional and personal evolution that had unfolded since our partnership began. Montgomery Financial had transformed from family fiefdom to modern institution with merit-based leadership and sustainable investment principles. Kevin had evolved from dynastic successor seeking paternal approval to authentic leader guiding institutional adaptation through demonstrated capability rather than inherited authority. Our personal relationship had undergone equally profound transformation, though along a different trajectory than either reconciliation or complete separation. The careful exploration we had begun during partnership implementation had evolved into a balanced connection that honored our individual growth while maintaining meaningful bonds where authentic alignment existed. The award ceremony committee asked if we would co-present the Lifetime Achievement Recognition next year, Kevin mentioned as we watched boats moving along the river below, as representatives of the partnership that reshaped Lakefield's financial approach. I told them I'd discuss it with you before confirming. The request symbolized how completely external perception of our relationship had evolved, from Montgomery, daughter-in-law to equal partner in financial innovation, from dismissed outsider to recognized visionary whose methodology had transformed regional investment approaches. That seems appropriate, I agreed, appreciating his consultation rather than assumption. The collaborative nature of our partnership is what made it succeed where either individual institution might have failed alone. As we turned to rejoin the remaining attendees, Kevin added, "I had dinner with my father yesterday. He mentioned that working with the Foundation Board on sustainable community investment has given him new perspective on what you were trying to accomplish all those years at Montgomery Financial." This acknowledgement represented perhaps the most surprising evolution of all. Richard Montgomery, not merely accepting, but actively engaging with the sustainable principles he had once dismissed as naive idealism. Whether this transformation reflected genuine conviction or simply pragmatic adaptation to changing realities remained uncertain, but its practical impact was the same: redirecting resources toward more sustainable and inclusive financial practices. Better late than never, I observed with a slight smile. Institutional evolution happens at different paces for different participants. What matters is the ultimate direction rather than the initial resistance. This philosophical approach, focusing on long-term transformation rather than short-term conversion, had guided our partnership implementation from the beginning. Rather than demanding immediate acknowledgement of sustainable principles, we had created conditions where their practical value became increasingly evident through implementation results. This patient strategy had ultimately proven more effective than confrontational approaches at generating lasting institutional change. As the evening concluded and we prepared to go our separate ways, Kevin to his downtown condominium, me to my home in Lakefield's revitalized arts district, I reflected on the journey that had transformed both our professional landscape and personal circumstances. 5 years earlier, I had been the dismissed outsider whose investment methodology was mocked at Montgomery family dinner parties. Now, Wright Capital's approach was the foundation of regional financial evolution, licensed to institutions across multiple markets and generating consistent outperformance while addressing environmental and social considerations. 5 years earlier, Montgomery Financial had been a family fiefdom resistant to necessary adaptation despite clear warning signs. Now it operated with independent governance, merit-based leadership, and sustainable investment principles, serving client interests more effectively than its traditional approach ever had. 5 years earlier, Kevin had been caught between family loyalty and professional judgment, unable to fully support either Montgomery tradition or necessary evolution. Now he led the institution with authentic authority earned through performance rather than inherited through family connection. Our personal relationship had evolved along a similarly transformative path, though with different outcomes than either reconciliation or complete separation might have suggested. We had carefully constructed a connection based on authentic alignment, rather than external expectation, maintaining meaningful bonds where genuine shared values existed while respecting individual growth in divergent directions. This balanced approach, preserving what worked while reforming what didn't, characterized both our professional partnership and personal relationship. Neither rigid maintenance of traditional structures nor complete disruption in favor of entirely new models, but thoughtful evolution that honored legitimate heritage while embracing necessary change. As I drove home through Lakefield's transformed financial district, I reflected on the extraordinary journey from dismissed outsider to recognized innovator, from Montgomery Financial's disregarded daughter-in-law to Greenlight Capital's visionary leader guiding regional financial evolution. The transformation hadn't come through destroying those who had dismissed me, but through creating something valuable enough to transform the very institutions and relationships that had once seemed immovably arrayed against me. Not victory through elimination of opposition, but success through elevation of alternatives too compelling to ignore. This approach had ultimately proven more powerful than either resentful withdrawal or vindictive conquest could have achieved. By developing methodology valuable enough to save Montgomery Financial from its self-created crisis, I had reshaped Lakefield's financial landscape more completely than hostile takeover or competitive displacement ever could have accomplished. The lesson extended beyond our specific circumstances to broader questions of institutional evolution across markets and sectors. Transformation didn't require destruction of existing structures or blind preservation of outdated approaches. The most effective path integrated valid heritage with necessary adaptation, creating stronger institutions capable of serving broader interests more sustainably than either tradition or disruption alone could achieve. As I arrived home and looked out from my terrace at Lakefield's illuminated skyline, I felt a sense of completion different from what I might have anticipated 5 years earlier. Not the satisfaction of having proven critics wrong or defeated institutional opposition, but the deeper fulfillment of having created something constructive that transformed both professional landscapes and personal possibilities. The journey had required courage, resilience, and strategic patience, developing valuable methodology despite systematic dismissal, maintaining professional focus through personal disillusionment, creating partnership frameworks that served multiple interests rather than extracting narrow victory from institutional vulnerability. The results validated that approach more completely than I could have imagined when first overhearing those dismissive comments in Richard's study. Montgomery Financial had evolved from family fiefdom to modern institution with sustainable practices at its core. Reynolds Capital had achieved strategic growth through collaboration rather than conquest. Greenlight Capital had expanded from fledgling startup to respected industry leader influencing investment approaches across multiple markets. Most importantly, a template for balanced institutional evolution had emerged that transcended our specific circumstances, a model for how traditional organizations could adapt to changing realities without sacrificing legitimate heritage or embracing chaotic disruption. This framework offered a middle path between rigid preservation and complete displacement, creating more value more sustainably than either alternative alone could generate. As the lights of Lakefield's financial district reflected on the river below, I recognized that our journey represented more than personal vindication or professional success. It demonstrated the transformative potential of balanced evolution, preserving what works while reforming what doesn't, honoring heritage while embracing necessary change, creating conditions where authentic value can flourish regardless of traditional power structures or established hierarchies. That demonstration would continue influencing financial approaches far beyond our regional partnership, offering a template for institutional adaptation that served broader interests than either preservation or disruption alone could achieve. Not by destroying what came before, but by transforming it into something better than what anyone had previously imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.